When US tanks rolled into Vietnam, they weren't just fighting the enemy, they were fighting the terrain, the tactics, and the ghosts of a war they were never designed for. No tank duels. No open plains. Just jungle, mud, and an enemy that refused to play by the rules. But then, when the war was almost over, everything changed. Out of nowhere, a full-scale tank assault hit like a thunderclap. American tanks were there to respond, but not with American crews. Let's rewind and see how we got here. In 1965, US leaders believed the only way to stop communism from spreading in Vietnam was to put boots on the ground. So they did it, starting with 3,500 Marines landing at Da Nang, tanks in tow. But while the soldiers were ready for battle, the battle they trained for didn't exist. For decades, the US military had been preparing for Soviet tanks racing across the fields of Europe. Tanks like the M48 Patton, with its heavy armor and 90mm cannon, were built for those open, armored slugfests. Vietnam was the exact opposite: dense jungles, narrow trails, and an enemy that vanished into the trees. Still, commanders believed firepower could win the day. So they kept sending in the tanks. The M48 Patton was joined by M113 APCs for troop support, Zippo tanks with flamethrowers, and the bizarre-looking M50 Ontis packed with recoilless rifles. Later came the M551 Sheridan, airdrop-ready and armed with a giant 152mm gun. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese had older tanks like Soviet T-34s and Chinese Type 59s, but they were rarely used early on. Interestingly, Australia sent in their own Centurion tanks. They were fewer in number, but far more surgical in how they were used and surprisingly effective. At first, US tanks guarded bases and supply lines. But that changed with Operation Starlight. Expecting a major Viet Cong assault, US forces tried to strike first. Tanks led the way, but they moved without infantry cover. On narrow jungle roads, they had no eyes in the trees, no protection on the flanks, just steel coffins rolling into a kill zone. The lead tank took a direct hit from an RPG just short of open ground. It blocked the path, trapping the rest of the column. Then the jungle exploded. Close-range chaos. No communication. The last tank reversed out for help while another held off the attack alone. The survivors were rescued the next day. On paper, it was a success. But the cost was steep: nearly a quarter of the crews were killed or wounded. From then on, American tanks were everywhere, but always at a disadvantage. The terrain funneled them into roads lined with mines and ambushes. Viet Cong fighters used a brutal tactic called hugging the belt, getting so close to US troops that tanks couldn't fire without hitting their own men. Tank crews had to improvise, riding exposed with shotguns and grenade launchers, firing beehive rounds, canisters packed with thousands of steel darts, into point-blank ambushes. It was desperate. But it worked, sometimes. Then came the Tet Offensive in 1968. Cities like Hue turned into death traps. RPGs rained from rooftops, alleys, and windows. Tank visibility was almost zero. To make things worse, commanders restricted firing to protect historic buildings. Crews had to request permission before engaging, even if an RPG was pointed right at them. Frustration doesn't begin to describe it. And then, finally, a real tank battle. In March 1969, at the Ben Het base, 3 American M48s spotted incoming North Vietnamese PT-76 tanks using infrared night vision. They were dug in on high ground, perfect positioning. They took out 2 enemy tanks quickly. One NVA shell hit a tank hatch, killing 2 Americans. But the rest withdrew. For the first time in the war, tanks had fought the way they were designed to and won. By the early 1970s, American troops were leaving, but the war was far from over. With backing from the Soviet Union and China, North Vietnam prepared for a bold strike. In 1972, they launched the Easter Offensive, over 150 tanks charging with 30,000 troops in a conventional, full-force invasion. Finally, the war became what US tanks were built for, just as the Americans left. South Vietnamese crews in M48s took up the fight. In one battle, they destroyed 11 T-54 tanks in minutes. But the enemy was prepared. The assault dragged on for 7 months. And in 1975, North Vietnamese armor rolled into Saigon, ending the war with tanks on parade. US tanks entered Vietnam expecting to face Soviet armor in open battle. Instead, they rolled into jungles, rice paddies, and ambushes. By the time the kind of war they were built for finally arrived, they were already gone. It was a mismatch from day one, and a missed opportunity in the end. If you found this story compelling and want more untold moments from military history, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. There's so much more we haven't been told.